She wasn't born a monster. England made her one. History remembers her as Bloody Mary, the queen who burned her own people alive. A tyrant, a fanatic, a symbol of fear. But monsters are not born in palaces. They are built there, before the flames, before the executions, before the terror. There was a little girl, a princess, a daughter who once believed she was loved. And then everything was taken from her. Her mother, her title, her legitimacy, her faith, her future, stripped away, piece by piece, in front of an entire kingdom. Imagine being told at 11 years old that you're no longer a princess, that your mother is no longer your mother, that your father, the most powerful man in England, no longer claims you as his own. Imagine watching the world you were born into collapse, not because of war, not because of invasion, but because your father wanted a son. This is not just the story of a queen. This is the story of humiliation, of religious violence inside a child's mind, of isolation so deep it calcified into rage. Because when a child grows up inside betrayal, power doesn't heal them, it arms them. Mary Tudor did not wake up one morning and decide to become Bloody Mary. She was shaped by rejection, by political games she didn't understand, by a father who erased her existence to satisfy his obsession, by a country that cheered while she was declared illegitimate. And here is the question history rarely asks. What happens when a broken child finally gets the crown? What happens when the girl who was silenced becomes the voice of God in a nation that once silenced her? Revenge? Justice? Redemption? Or something darker? Because trauma does not disappear. It waits. It grows quietly in the shadows. And when it finally has power, it speaks in fire. Tonight, we go deeper than the executions, deeper than the Protestant versus Catholic conflict, deeper than the nickname. Tonight, we examine the psychological architecture of a queen forged in rejection. We return to the moment everything changed, not when she lit the pyres, but when she first felt abandoned. Because if you want to understand Bloody Mary, you must first understand the girl who learned that love could be revoked, and the kingdom that taught her fear was power. But before the flames rose over England, there was a fracture, and fractures, when left untreated, don't disappear. They split the crown in two, and Mary would spend her entire life trying to put it back together, at any cost. In the next chapter, we go back to the palace, to the golden years of Princess Mary, when she was adored, celebrated, and destined for greatness. Because what she lost is the key to what she became. Before she was feared, she was treasured. Mary Tudor was not born into uncertainty. She was born into celebration. In 1516, when she entered the world, England rejoiced. Bells rang, bonfires burned, diplomats sent congratulations across Europe. She was the only surviving child of King Henry VIII and Queen Catherine of Aragon. And for a moment, she was enough. Her father adored her. Henry VIII, still young, still charming, still unbroken by obsession, called her his pearl of the world. She rode beside him. She performed for foreign ambassadors. She was educated like a prince. Languages, music, theology, politics. Mary wasn't raised to be ornamental. She was raised to matter. As a child, she could already speak Latin fluently. She corresponded with scholars. She impressed royal courts across Europe. She wasn't weak. She wasn't fragile. She was disciplined, intelligent, devout, and above all, she was secure. Secure in her mother's love. Secure in her father's approval. Secure in her identity as Princess of Wales, heir to the throne if no son arrived. But beneath the pageantry, something was rotting. Henry wanted a son, not eventually, now, because in Tudor England, daughters were alliances. Sons were permanents. Every year that Catherine of Aragon failed to produce a surviving male heir, pressure mounted. Whispers grew louder in court. Advisors leaned closer to the king. And Henry, once affectionate, once patient, began to change. And children notice change long before adults admit it. Mary would have felt it first in small ways. Fewer smiles, fewer visits, fewer moments on her father's knee. The warmth cooled gradually, not overnight, which makes it worse, because sudden loss is shocking. Slow withdrawal is destabilizing. And then came the theological justification. Henry convinced himself, and eventually half of England, that his marriage to Catherine was cursed, that God was punishing him with dead sons because he had married his brother's widow. It wasn't politics anymore. It was divine reasoning. And when a father decides that God is against your mother, you become collateral damage. Mary was around 11 when the unraveling began publicly. Old enough to understand humiliation, too young to defend herself. Her mother was sent away from court. Mary was forbidden from seeing her. She was moved into her own household, separated, monitored, isolated. And still, she believed this was temporary. Children always believe that. They assume love will restore order. They assume father's return. They assume injustice corrects itself. But this wasn't a family argument. This was a king dismantling a queen. And Mary was the living reminder of that marriage, which meant she had to be dismantled too. In 1533, Henry married in Boleyn, and in one stroke of parliamentary legislation, Mary ceased to be legitimate, not symbolically, legally. She was no longer Princess Mary. She was simply Lady Mary. Imagine that. One document, one signature, and your identity evaporates. No ceremony, no explanation, no apology, just erasure. Her household was dissolved, her servants dismissed, her status revoked. She was ordered to serve in the household of her infant half-sister, Elizabeth, the daughter of the woman who replaced her mother. This was not just political demotion. It was psychological humiliation. Mary refused at first to acknowledge Elizabeth as princess, refused to call her mother queen, refused to accept that her own mother's marriage was invalid. And that refusal marked her. She was labeled stubborn, disobedient, fanatical. But what she was really doing was holding onto the last fragment of identity she had left. If she accepted Anne Boleyn as queen, then her mother was nothing. And if her mother was nothing, what did that make her? This is where the fracture deepened. Because loyalty, when punished, turns into isolation. Mary was increasingly alone, watched, pressured, threatened. She was told she must sign a document acknowledging that her parents' marriage had been unlawful, that she was illegitimate, that her father was head of the church, not the Pope. To sign would mean survival. To refuse would mean possible execution. She was 17 and already negotiating with mortality. This wasn't a spoiled princess throwing tantrums. This was a young woman being forced to betray her mother to stay alive. And something inside her hardened. Not hatred, not yet. Something quieter, something colder. Resolve. Because when you're stripped of title, comfort, affection, and safety, faith becomes the only thing no one can take. And Mary clung to Catholicism not just as religion, but as identity, as defiance, as proof that her mother mattered. And when Catherine of Aragon died in 1536, Mary was not allowed to attend the funeral, not allowed to mourn publicly, not allowed to grieve as a daughter. Grief without ritual does not heal. It ferments, and in that fermentation, trauma begins to crystallize. But the worst humiliation was still coming, because survival would demand something that would haunt her forever. And the question becomes, when a daughter is forced to choose between loyalty to her dead mother and obedience to her living father, what breaks first, her faith or her heart? By 1536, Mary Tudor was exhausted. Years of pressure, years of isolation, years of being reminded that she was no longer a princess, only a problem. Her mother was dead, and Boleyn had just been executed. The court was unstable, unpredictable, dangerous. And Henry VIII was no longer the warm father of her childhood. He was a king who had executed a queen and could execute a daughter. Mary was sick during much of this period, physically weakened, possibly from stress-related illness. But illness did not exempt her from obedience. The demand was simple: sign the oath, acknowledge that her parents' marriage had been unlawful, recognize her father as supreme head of the Church of England, admit she was illegitimate. On paper, it was a political formality. In reality, it was a psychological execution. To sign meant publicly declaring that her mother, Catherine of Aragon, had lived in sin, that she herself had been born in sin, that everything she had defended for years was false. Mary resisted as long as she could, but resistance requires leverage, and she had none. Her allies were gone. Her mother was buried far from her. The Pope was powerless in England. The court was watching, and Henry made it clear, if she refused, she would be treated as a traitor. Traitors did not live long. So Mary did something that would shape her forever. She signed, not because she believed it, but because she wanted to survive. That signature saved her life and fractured something inside her. Because when survival demands that you deny your own truth, the damage doesn't disappear. It goes underground. Mary never forgave herself for signing that document. Even years later, she would describe it as one of the greatest sins of her life. This is crucial to understand. The woman history calls Bloody Mary was, at her core, a person haunted by guilt. Not guilt for burning Protestants. Guilt for betraying her mother. For submitting. For bending. And when guilt mixes with religious devotion, it doesn't create moderation. It creates extremism. Because extremism feels like purification. After Anne Boleyn's execution, Mary was cautiously restored to favor. Henry's third wife, Jane Seymour, attempted reconciliation. For a brief moment, father and daughter found something resembling peace. But it was not the same. Love, once withdrawn, does not fully return. Mary had learned a lesson that would never leave her. Affection from power is conditional, and conditional love breeds vigilance. Then, in 1537, a son was finally born, Edward, the long-awaited male heir. Everything Mary had once symbolized, legitimacy, succession, importance, now belonged to someone else. She was no longer the hope of England. She was the reminder of its failure. Edward's birth reshaped the political future of the kingdom. It also quietly confirmed something inside Mary. She would never again be central, never again secure, never again unquestioned. She adapted, outwardly obedient, politically cautious, religiously unwavering. But beneath the surface, layers were forming. Humiliation, grief, guilt, religious absolutism, distrust. And here's where psychology deepens. Mary didn't become cruel in this period. She became rigid, rigid in belief, rigid in loyalty, rigid in identity. Because flexibility had once cost her everything. To bend was to risk erasure. So she stopped bending. Years passed. Henry grew older, heavier, more volatile. Mary learned to survive court politics quietly. She watched stepmother after stepmother rise and fall. And Boleyn executed. Jane Seymour dead after childbirth. Anne of Cleves divorced. Catherine Howard executed. Catherine Parr barely surviving suspicion. Marriage in the Tudor court was not romance. It was risk. Mary internalized another lesson. Power is unstable. Security is illusion. And mercy is temporary. When Henry VIII died in 1547, Mary was 31 years old. No longer a child. No longer powerless. But not yet queen. The throne passed to Edward VI, her half-brother, a boy, 9 years old. And with him came a Protestant regency. If Henry had broken from Rome for political reasons, Edward's advisors wanted to dismantle Catholicism completely. Churches were stripped, Latin Mass abolished, images destroyed, priests married, doctrine rewritten. To Mary, this was not reform. It was sacrilege. It was the final insult to her mother's memory, to the faith she had clung to when everything else was stripped away. And once again, she was pressured. Once again, she was told to conform. Once again, she refused. This time, she was not a teenager. She was a royal adult with supporters. Edward's government demanded she abandon Catholic Mass in her household. She continued it anyway. The tension escalated. Councils debated her defiance. Ambassadors reported on her stubbornness. Threats resurfaced. But something had changed. Mary was no longer isolated. She had foreign allies, including Emperor Charles V, her cousin. She had sympathy among Catholic nobles. She had grown into someone who understood the machinery of power, and she was no longer afraid of being illegitimate. She had already survived that. What she had not yet survived was destiny, because Edward was sick, young, frail, dying. And when a boy king begins to fade, succession becomes war without swords. And Mary, the once discarded daughter, was about to become the most dangerous woman in England. Not because she sought chaos, but because history had cornered her into it. And when history corners someone who has survived humiliation, betrayal, religious conflict, and political erasure, they do not step aside quietly. They claim what they believe is divinely theirs. The trauma that began in childhood was about to meet opportunity, and England was not prepared for what that combination would produce. In 1553, England held its breath. Edward VI was dying. He was 15, thin, pale, Protestant to the core, raised by men who believed Catholicism was not just wrong, but dangerous. And Mary Tudor was Catholic. That alone made her a threat. Legally, she was next in line after Edward. Henry VIII's Act of Succession had restored her to the order of inheritance, even if it never fully restored her legitimacy and spirit. But legality and power are not the same thing. Edward's advisors feared her, not because she was cruel, not yet, but because they knew what she represented: a reversal, a reckoning, a return to Rome. And so, as Edward's health deteriorated, a plan was formed. If Mary inherited the throne, Protestant reforms would collapse, so they would simply remove her from the equation. Edward was persuaded to alter the succession. Instead of Mary or Elizabeth, the crown would pass to Lady Jane Grey, a Protestant, young, malleable, safe. Jane Grey did not ask for this. She was a pawn, but pawns become queens when kings are desperate. When Edward died in July 1553, the coup moved quickly. Jane was declared queen. Mary was declared illegitimate again. Not by law this time, but by force of politics. It was happening again. Erasure, displacement, replacement. But this time, Mary was not 11 years old. This time, she did not wait for permission to exist. When she heard of Edward's death and Jane's proclamation, Mary did something that reveals the core of her transformation. She moved first. She fled to East Anglia, a region with strong Catholic support. She wrote letters to nobles across England declaring herself the rightful queen. She did not beg. She commanded. She invoked not just her father's will, but divine authority. This is critical. Mary did not see her claim as ambition. She saw it as justice, as restoration, as correction of divine disorder. And that belief gave her clarity. While London staged coronation ceremonies for Jane Grey, support for Mary surged across the countryside. Men gathered, armies formed, nobles hesitated, because legitimacy carries weight. And the people remembered Henry VIII's daughter. Within 9 days, the tide turned. 9 days. Jane Grey's reign collapsed almost as quickly as it had begun. The council in London switched allegiance. Support for Mary overwhelmed resistance. And on July 19, 1553, Mary Tudor was proclaimed Queen of England. Not by marriage, not by manipulation, by force of claim and will. After decades of humiliation, after being declared illegitimate, after signing away her own identity to survive, she had taken the crown. This moment is often painted as triumph, and it was. But psychologically, it was something more complex. Because when someone who has lived through betrayal finally gains power, they do not govern from neutrality. They govern from memory. Mary entered London not as a fragile woman seeking reconciliation. She entered as someone who had waited her entire life for restoration. Crowds cheered her. Bells rang. Bonfires burned, just as they had when she was born. History had curved back on itself. The discarded princess had returned as queen. But trauma does not dissolve with applause. It sharpens. One of her first decisions revealed everything. Lady Jane Grey, the teenage girl used against her, was imprisoned in the Tower of London. At first, Mary showed restraint. Jane had been manipulated. Jane had not orchestrated the coup. Mary spared her, for a time, because even now, Mary did not see herself as cruel. She saw herself as merciful within justice. But the political landscape was unstable. Protestant factions still feared her. Rebellion simmered. Foreign powers watched. And Mary understood something deeply ingrained from childhood. Threats ignored become disasters. So she began consolidating authority. Catholic Mass was restored. Protestant reforms were reversed. Symbols removed under Edward were returned. For Mary, this was not regression. It was healing. She believed England had been spiritually wounded, and she was the instrument chosen to repair it. But the more she pushed, the more resistance hardened. The Wyatt Rebellion in 1554 was the breaking point. Led by Protestant nobles, it aimed to overthrow her, partially fueled by fear of her planned marriage to Philip of Spain. Foreign marriage, Catholic king, potential Spanish influence. The paranoia grew. London nearly fell. Mary refused to flee. She rode to the Guildhall and addressed the citizens directly. Her speech was fierce, controlled, determined. She declared she would die a queen rather than live dishonored. And the people sided with her. The rebellion failed. But now, mercy looked different. Wyatt was executed, and so was Lady Jane Grey. The girl Mary had once spared was beheaded. Here is where the transformation becomes visible. Because mercy, once perceived as weakness, was no longer an option. Mary had survived erasure twice. She would not risk a third time. From this point forward, security would outweigh sympathy, and trauma would begin to express itself not as survival, but as purification. She had reclaimed the throne, but she had not yet reclaimed certainty. And certainty was something she could only achieve one way: by eliminating what she believed had poisoned England in the first place. The question was no longer whether she would restore Catholicism. The question was how far she would go, and how much fire she believed redemption required. Mary was queen. She had fought for the crown. She had defended her claim. She had survived humiliation, betrayal, erasure, and rebellion. Now, she faced something different: expectation. A queen in the 16th century did not rule alone for long. She was expected to marry, to produce an heir, to secure stability. And stability, in Mary's mind, meant one thing above all else: a Catholic future. Her choice was Philip of Spain, son of Emperor Charles V, powerful, Catholic, politically strategic. To Mary, Philip was more than a husband. He was validation, a reinforcement of divine order, a bridge back to Rome, a symbol that her suffering had not been meaningless. But to England, he was foreign, Spanish, influential, a threat to national independence. The announcement of the marriage sparked fear across the kingdom. The Wyatt Rebellion had already shown how fragile Mary's position was, and though she had crushed it, the anxiety remained. Mary was 40 years old when she married Philip in 1554. 40, in an era when women often bore children in their teens. Time was not generous, and here, something deeply psychological emerges. Mary's entire identity had been built on legitimacy. Legitimate daughter, legitimate faith, legitimate queen. Now her legitimacy depended on something she could not control: her body. She needed an heir, not just for the throne, but for proof. Proof that God had not abandoned her. Proof that her restoration was blessed. Proof that her suffering had a purpose. Soon after the marriage, Mary announced she was pregnant. The courts celebrated. England prepared for a Catholic heir. But months passed, and no child came. Mary's abdomen swelled. She experienced symptoms. The nation waited. And then, nothing. It was a phantom pregnancy, a false hope. In modern terms, we understand pseudocyesis, a psychological condition where intense desire for pregnancy produces physical symptoms. In Mary's time, it was humiliation, public, crushing, spiritual, because to her, infertility was not medical. It was divine judgment. The woman who believed she had been chosen to restore God's true church could not produce the future. And something shifted. If Mary could not secure Catholicism through lineage, she would secure it through purification. In 1555, the burnings began. Protestant leaders were arrested, tried for heresy, and condemned. Among the first were bishops, men of influence, theologians, reformers. They were tied to stakes. Wood was piled. Flames rose. Over the next 3 years, nearly 300 Protestants would be burned at the stake. Men, women, even the elderly. Public executions. Visible, loud, unforgettable. And here is where history simplifies her into a monster. But simplification hides motive. Mary did not burn people for pleasure. She believed she was saving souls. In Catholic doctrine at the time, heresy was not just political dissent. It was spiritual infection. And infection spreads. To Mary, Protestantism had infected England. It had justified her mother's humiliation. It had invalidated her childhood. It had rewritten truth. If it was not eradicated, it would damn the nation eternally. This is the tragic paradox. The girl who had felt powerless while watching her world dismantled now believed she was preventing divine catastrophe. Trauma had fused with theology. And when trauma fuses with absolute belief, compromise feels like betrayal. But something else was happening beneath the surface. The burnings were not restoring unity. They were creating martyrs. Spectacle can intimidate, but it can also inspire resistance. Protestant pamphlets circulated secretly. Stories of suffering spread. Images of men and women praying in flames moved people emotionally. Mary intended purification. She produced polarization. And Philip? He was distant, often absent, more invested in European politics than in English reform. Mary adored him. Letters show her affection, her dependence. But he did not share her intensity. He did not burn with the same personal history. For him, England was strategy. For her, it was redemption. And then a second pregnancy was announced. Hope resurfaced. Again, the court prepared. Again, anticipation swelled. And again, nothing. Another phantom. Another public unraveling. This time, the humiliation cut deeper. Because age was advancing, time was narrowing, and Protestant resistance was not weakening. Mary began to look tired in portraits from this period. Heavier, solemn, not the triumphant queen of 1553, but a woman carrying invisible weight. Her burnings continued. Her authority held, but emotionally, cracks were widening. The woman who had fought to reclaim identity was now fighting to preserve meaning. Because if the fires did not restore England, if her womb did not produce an heir, if Philip did not remain devoted, then what had all the suffering been for? And that is the most dangerous psychological space of all. When someone begins to fear that their life's mission might fail, that fear does not create softness. It creates escalation. Mary had once signed a document to survive. Now she signed death warrants to secure eternity. And she believed history would understand. It did not. Instead, it gave her a name, Bloody Mary, a name that would eclipse everything else. But we are not at the end yet, because decline is quieter than fire. And Mary's final years would reveal something deeper than cruelty. They would reveal exhaustion, and the terrifying possibility that trauma, once given power, does not heal. It consumes. Power is loud in its rise. It is quiet in its decline. By the late 1550s, Mary was no longer the triumphant queen who had marched into London to reclaim her birthright. She was a woman aging in a court that felt colder every year. The burnings continued, but something had shifted. They were no longer acts of confident restoration. They were acts of insistence. Insistence that this suffering meant something. Insistence that God was still aligned with her. Insistence that England would eventually return to obedience. But reality was resisting her. Philip was rarely in England. He had larger ambitions: Spain, the Holy Roman Empire, continental wars. Mary had married for unity of faith. Philip had married for political leverage. Their relationship was not abusive. It was simply unbalanced. She loved him, He respected her, but he did not belong to England the way she did, and he did not carry the scars she carried. When he left for long stretches, Mary was alone in a palace full of courtiers who complied, but did not necessarily believe. Isolation is dangerous for someone whose identity is built on divine mission, because without affirmation, conviction turns inward, and inward conviction can become doubt. Then came another blow. In 1558, England lost Calais. Calais had been England's last remaining possession in France, a symbol of historic strength, pride, continuity. It had belonged to England for over 2 centuries. Under Mary's reign, it fell to the French. The loss was strategic, military, political, but symbolically it was catastrophic. Critics used it as proof that her reign was weak, that her focus on religion had distracted from defense, that her marriage to Spain had entangled England in foreign conflict. Mary reportedly said that when she died, the word Calais would be found engraved upon her heart. Whether she truly said it or not, the sentiment fits. Because for Mary, loss was not abstract. It was personal. Her entire life had been marked by things taken away. Her title, her mother, her legitimacy, her security, her pregnancies, now her territory. Each loss reinforced the same underlying fear. Nothing stays. Nothing is safe. Nothing is guaranteed. And when that fear is never resolved in childhood, it never truly leaves adulthood. Her health began to fail. Historians debate the exact cause. Possibly cancer, possibly influenza, possibly ovarian disease. What is certain is this. By 1558, Mary knew she was dying. She was 42 years old, no living child, no Catholic heir, and waiting in the wings was Elizabeth, her half-sister, Protestant, daughter of Anne Boleyn, the woman whose existence had once replaced her. Imagine the psychological weight of that realization. After everything, after reclaiming the throne, after restoring Catholicism, after burning nearly 300 heretics in the name of purification, after enduring humiliation, phantom pregnancies, rebellion, and political isolation, the future would not belong to her vision. It would belong to Elizabeth. And Elizabeth represented the undoing of everything Mary believed she had corrected. This is the final tragedy. Mary had spent her entire life fighting erasure. Yet history would remember her not as the first queen to rule England in her own right, not as the woman who reclaimed the throne through force of will, not as the daughter who survived humiliation, but as Bloody Mary, a single dimension, a single narrative, a single stain. In her final months, the execution slowed, energy faded, conviction remained, but strength diminished. There is no record of dramatic repentance, no final confession of regret for the burnings. Because Mary never believed she had been cruel. She believed she had been necessary. That is what makes her story unsettling. Monsters act from chaos. Mary acted from order, from doctrine, from trauma rationalized as duty. She died on November 17, 1558, the same day Elizabeth was proclaimed queen. The transition was almost seamless, as if history had already decided which sister would endure. Elizabeth's reign would be remembered as a golden age. Mary's is a dark chapter, but history often prefers stability over struggle. Elizabeth inherited a throne secured by Mary's hard-won legitimacy. Elizabeth ruled without a husband, something Mary had believed impossible. Elizabeth navigated religion with calculated ambiguity, something Mary had refused to do. Where Mary had sought purification, Elizabeth sought balance. And that difference defines how they are remembered. But let's return to the beginning. She wasn't born a monster. England made her one. Did England create her cruelty? Or did it create her fear? Because fear, when given absolute power, can look like brutality. And a child who learns that identity can be erased will grow into an adult who tries to erase threats first. Mary Tudor did not invent religious violence. She inherited a kingdom already fractured by it. She did not create absolutism. She absorbed it from a father who declared himself head of a church, from a court that shifted truth by decree, from a nation that applauded legitimacy one year and revoked it the next. Her tragedy is not that she became powerful. It is that power never healed what had been broken. The trauma remained. It simply gained authority. And when trauma gains authority, it governs defensively. It governs urgently. It governs without compromise. History judged her by the flames. But those flames began long before the stakes were built. They began in a young girl's mind, when love became conditional, when identity became negotiable, when survival required denial. The fires of 1555 were visible. The fire of 1533 was not, but it burned just as intensely. And perhaps that is the uncomfortable truth. We often ask how a ruler becomes cruel. We rarely ask what made them afraid. Mary Tudor's life is not a simple morality tale. It is a psychological arc. From adored princess, to discarded daughter, to defiant survivor, to absolute queen, to isolated believer, to historical villain. But somewhere inside that arc, the child remained. The one who once believed she was enough. And when that belief shattered, England would feel the consequences. When Mary died, there were no bonfires, no roaring celebrations, no triumphant sense of destiny fulfilled. There was relief. Relief in some corners, silence in others, uncertainty everywhere. Elizabeth was proclaimed queen within hours. Protestant exiles began returning almost immediately. The machinery of reform restarted. And just like that, Mary's restoration began to unravel. But here is the deeper irony. Mary spent her entire reign trying to restore the past. Elizabeth would secure the future. And history favors those who stabilize. It does not favor those who struggle visibly. Mary's burnings became legend. The number, nearly 300, would be repeated for centuries. Her name would enter folklore. Children would chant Bloody Mary in mirrors long after theology was forgotten. Her psychological story would vanish. And that disappearance may be the most tragic part, because Mary Tudor was not a caricature. She was a product of dynastic anxiety, religious absolutism, and paternal rejection. She was raised in a court where truth could be rewritten by decree, where queens were discarded, where loyalty was fatal, where identity depended on male approval. She internalized every lesson, and when she finally gained authority, she governed according to what she had learned. Control the narrative, control the faith, eliminate instability. Do not allow dissent to grow. Never again allow yourself to be erased. Her actions were extreme, but her logic was consistent. That consistency is what makes her story chilling, because she did not wake up transformed. She evolved, gradually, step by step, each humiliation tightening something inside her, each loss reinforcing rigidity, each threat confirming that compromise leads to disappearance. By the time she became queen, the foundation was already set. Power did not corrupt her. It revealed how she had been shaped. And that is the uncomfortable mirror history holds up. If Mary had been born a son, would she have been remembered as strong instead of cruel? If her father had not broken from Rome, would she have ruled moderately? If she had borne a healthy heir, would her reign feel stable rather than desperate? We cannot know, but we can trace the fracture lines. 1533, declared illegitimate. 1536, forced to sign her own humiliation. 1553, forced to fight for her crown. 1555, forced to prove religious purity. 1558, forced to confront failure. A life defined by defense. Defense of identity, defense of faith, defense of legitimacy, and defense, when prolonged, becomes aggression. By the time Elizabeth inherited the throne, England was exhausted. Religious violence had scarred communities. Trust had eroded. Fear had lingered too long. Elizabeth learned from Mary's mistakes. She avoided mass executions for doctrine. She crafted a middle path. She ruled with calculation rather than correction. Where Mary sought divine certainty, Elizabeth embraced political ambiguity. That difference shaped their legacies. But neither sister was born into ease. Both were daughters of a king who destabilized an entire nation for personal desire. Both were shaped by a court where survival required performance. One responded with rigidity, the other with strategy. History crowned one golden and stained the other red. But when we look beyond the flames, beyond the nickname, beyond the simplified villainy, we find something more human. A woman who never recovered from being told she did not belong. A daughter who never healed from watching her mother erased. A believer who fused personal trauma with divine mission. And a ruler who mistook intensity for righteousness. She wasn't born a monster. England made her one. That statement is not absolution. It is context, because trauma does not excuse harm, but it explains transformation. Mary Tudor's tragedy is not just that she burned her enemies. It is that she believed she was saving them. That is what makes her story linger. Not the fire, but the conviction behind it. And perhaps the final lesson is this. When a nation teaches a child that identity can be revoked, that truth can be rewritten, that love is conditional, it should not be surprised when that child grows up to rule defensively, or absolutely, or fearfully. Mary sought control because control had once been taken from her. She sought purification because her own life had felt contaminated by betrayal. She sought permanence because everything she loved had been temporary. In the end, she did not secure the Catholic future she envisioned. She did not leave an heir. She did not rewrite her reputation. But she did leave something else. A warning that power placed in unhealed hands does not resolve pain. It amplifies it. And when pain governs a kingdom, it governs with fire.